As Richard mentioned, I want to give a little bit of a brief overview about European residential, not too much detail, but I think one of the things when you look back at the last 5 years, residential is definitely one of the sectors in real estate that has gained huge attention and that also has diversified quite heavily. We now talk about student housing, co-living, micro apartments, whatsoever. Things maybe 5-6 years ago nobody really thought of as real estate investment areas, catching a lot of capital from any type of institutional investors. When we look at residential, I think one of the interesting parts is it caters quite well with all the mega trends we see around the globe. We have an aging population, yes, but if you look residential in a wider universe, senior housing, care homes, whatsoever, there's a lot of opportunities there. So in the wider way, you can call them residential. You have, let's say, the ongoing urbanization. So you need, people are moving to the cities, and with these cities you need housing. So residential is the sector to be in if you want to house these people, as it's necessary to house them. If you look at the current discussions around Europe, we'll also see the challenges associated with these kind of where do you house all these people. And what I've pictured here with this gray shaded area, a third effect is actually supporting the institutional side of the rented residential market, particularly in Europe, and that is, since the 1960s up to the financial crisis, owner occupancy rates were growing across Europe. The only exception was more or less Germany and Switzerland. So that, at the end, a rental market only existed in a very limited number of countries. After the financial crisis, a lot of countries realized solidly relying on owner occupancy has economic costs associated with it. So the owner occupancy rate now started to drop in some countries, creating quite an interesting bunch of new renters, mostly in the 20s and 30s, as they are not so easily getting a mortgage anymore. They are not able to get a mortgage for 100% of the purchase price. They have to delay entering the housing ladder. So that creates also a very interesting part of tenants for the residential universe. And what is the effect of these kind of attractiveness from the economic point of view and from these megatrends? We see that today, you can say every fourth euro actually is spent in the residential universe. Might it be PRS, the classical multifamily housing, might it be student housing, we can include hotels, senior housing. If you look at all of these, every fourth euro is spent on residential. And I think that is something, going back 10 years, it was roughly half of that amount. So you see how that sector really gained a huge share of the overall market. And if you're going forward and expect what's happening, urbanization is something you see here, the development of urbanization from the 1960s up until 2050 for different countries, and you can really say urbanization is something that is here to stay, that we create additional demand in cities, and we have to provide some kind of housing to deal with that demand. And when we look at the completion side, yes, we're all happy that we see rising completions in most countries, but we're far off any levels we have seen of completions before the financial crisis. So being afraid of any kind of oversupply, even if you have growth rates of 10, 15, 20% in construction levels, is nothing we really need to be afraid of. And if you look at construction levels as percent of existing stock overall in Europe, the completion rate is 0.7%. So we we complete housing units of the amount of 0.7% of existing stock. And if you then think about what is the average time you can use a house, or how long you can use a residential unit, if it's 200 years, you need about 0.5% of stock for replacement already. So if you can then say, possibly being a German, we build for life, so maybe 200 years are the correct number. If you look at some other countries, 200 years might not be the correct number. So you can then argue, even if we are increasing our building capacity and build more, we are definitely not building enough for what we're currently seeing with the movement of people in mind to urban areas, to cities. And therefore we should not be surprised about all these rental movements and price movements we see across Europe. Even if construction activity is increasing, it's not catching up with what is actually needed in the market. And going forward, and that's a little bit of a closer look on countries, you see that construction activity in some countries on the left-hand side of that chart is actually really increasing, or it's expected to increase. But it's only a very few countries where you really reach levels above 1% of current stock, where you can really say we are adding substantially to our housing stock. It's not taking place in many countries. And if you look at updated figures of these kind of numbers, you already see that there are even fewer countries where you can say construction activity is substantially increasing. And the other side that it's currently high on the agenda on the political agenda is what's happening to rent levels. What you see on the left-hand side is a European rental cycle, and the good thing of that rental cycle is you see very few phases since the millennium where rents actually have been negative. The average never has been negative. The quartiles, the 25% quartile has a little bit been negative in some years, but overall I think that's also one of the attractiveness of residential. Rental growth is not that volatile as we've seen it in the commercial sectors. And one of the reasons why it's not that volatile is regulation that are pictured in the matrix on the right-hand side. You have two dimensions of regulation. You can say one is rent regulation, how you set rents, how you can increase rents, and what is included in rents. And the other side is the dimension of tenant landlord regulation, how easy it is to evict your tenants. And you see you have a quite diverse picture across Europe. But what this picture also tells you is regulation per se is not an issue for an institutional investor. Because the most regulated market on the top right corner up here is Sweden. And if you look at the Swedish market over the last 15-20 years, it has been an institutional residential market where a lot of Swedish institutions continuously invest. And if you look at all total return data available, the returns were not that miserable. So regulation per se is not the issue. The only thing when regulation becomes tricky is when you fiddle around with regulation every 6 to 8 months. And then it's also the predictability that goes away that regulation gives you in the market. So being a residential investor also means the stability of the rents is partly the reflection of the regulation in the markets you have. And you have to accept this and you have to deal with it going forward. So talking about this more or less on country level, overall actually when you look at residential, when you look at investing, maybe the story is not so much about countries today, it's about cities. And I think you have seen a lot of city rankings and development of city rankings, so I don't want to go in any details of the numbers we used here. I just want to point out one thing. Whenever you do these nice exercises about ranking creation, academically it's quite nice, as an economist you like to do it, and you come up with a nice top 10 number from London to Helsinki, which is quite nice. If you then go out to a client or first go to your transaction guy, he tells you it's quite nice but completely useless. So you add up. You need to add up a second dimension. We quickly realize. And looking at these top 10, and if you look at the cities in there, we created another top 10 of cities of the same. We looked at all the same cities and created the top 10 of the number of transactions we could found in the cities. And if you then look at these kind of liquidity score, you get a substantially different picture. But you also get why over the last 3-4 years everybody was attracted to Berlin, because it's simply the most liquid market where the most transactions took place. And it also tells you a little bit why everybody is so annoyed about what's going on in Berlin right now, because predictability of the Berlin market has a little bit deteriorated over the last months. So going forward, then the liquidity picture definitely will change, but that's the next dimension you need. Doing only that rating, nice exercise, but if you want to really learn something out of that ranking and use it, you need a second dimension we thought was liquidity, to come up with at the end a matrix with 2 dimensions, the attractiveness of a city and the liquidity of a city. And overall we looked at these for 119 cities, and have not included all these cities, but you have some cities, for instance, down here, economically highly attractive, a city like Luxembourg, for instance. Everybody would say economically Luxembourg is a city that should work over the coming years. But if you then look at an institutional resi market in Luxembourg, you find it quite challenging to find an asset. So this is the way how you can use the matrix, and that the matrix also can help you to deal with what's going on in the market. And I think that was for me a little bit of the starting point to give you an overview. How can you think about residential? What are aspects you should take into account? And possibly one of the most important things, for me personally, don't be afraid about regulation per se. Only be afraid about regulation when it's changing too much.